At the end of the morning, I was telling you that we are going to open a third roundtable on French forests in the face of climate change. I'd like to say hello to our speakers, Jean-François Daude, Sylvie Alexandre, Guillaume Santerie, and Antoine Damecourt, as well as Bertrand Savoy. Hello to all of you. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon and having accepted our invitation. As the new EU strategy for forests underscored for the post-2020 period, one of the flagship initiatives of the Green Deal is that forests are essential allies to fight against climate change and the loss in biodiversity. They are carbon sinks, they mitigate climate change effects because they cool down cities, they protect us from important floods, and they reduce the effects of droughts. Forests are also an ecosystem that from an energy transition point of view is a carbon sink, renewable energy, and the forest produces numerous products, timber, for instance, wood that is used as fuel and is the first renewable energy in France, 4% of French energy production. COP26, which took place this month, also committed towards forests. About 100 countries accounting for 85% of forests in the world have committed to reduce deforestation by 2030. Signatory countries committed to stop and revert the trend of deforestation and land degradation by 2030. China, Russia, France, Australia, or the US are part of this agreement. However, today, there are several challenges that need to be reconciled when it comes to forests and their function. Jean-François Daude, I'm going to start with you. You're a research director at INRAE in Orléans. Your specialty is to transform sustainable management practices of forest resources. Could you share your thoughts with us, please, Mr. Daude? IGN and INRAE in 2017 carried out a study on how forests can mitigate climate change while taking into account the constraints linked to the necessary adaptation of these forests and the emergence of major health crises. And at the time, they weren't important yet, those crises, but with time we saw that they became quite serious. What we showed in the study is that forests have two main functions. First, they act as carbon sinks, and second, they can help avoiding CO2 emissions if we choose wood as energy instead of other types of CO2 emitting energies. And by 2050, the impact of these two levers are going to be different. If we do business as usual, i.e. European forests are less and less managed, then the storage lever is going to account for the most important share. And if we decide to manage forests in a more sustainable way, it's what we call the substitution lever, that lever will emerge as the most important. And when you are faced with problems of large schools of insects, forest fires, etc., the forest carbon can be released massively into the atmosphere, and it is not controlled. It's especially not controlled if the forest is not managed, if there are less efficient means to manage it. So the contrast between the different options we have to manage the forests is very important when it comes to the viability, the sustainability of carbon assets linked to forests. If we keep our forests as they are and don't touch them, as recommended by some, we run the risk of a degradation of the CO2 balance And forests can even become releases of CO2 rather than storing CO2. But if we start managing our forests, if we use, for instance, wood also as a product and wood to heat our houses, etc., we will capitalize on carbon releases because there will be a great carbon benefit that will not be called into question by major forest hazards, potential fires, for instance. That's what I'm working on. Thank you very much. This is a good summary of the issue. I'm now going to give the floor to Mrs. Alexandre. Thank you, Sylvie Alexandre, for being with us. You are a member of the Académie d'Agriculture de France, and you work within France Bois Forêt and France Bois Industrie and Entreprise. I imagine you have a lot to say also on this afternoon's topic. Yes, absolutely. And what I'm going to say is really in line with what my neighbor just said. Before it is published, I would like to present the point of view of someone who worked within the Forêt and Filière Bois in the academy. We think it is timely to start talking about these issues. If you study the latest, if you read the latest study of the indicators, 2020, we as legislators see risks that are not very present in the public debate on forests. The debate is polarized around potential antagonism between forest management and biodiversity, as if managing forests be an attack against nature and meant deforestation. But we don't talk about what we see in sustainable management indicators. We see that more and more land is being used. Volumes have increased fivefold in terms of wood. It's an incredible amount of wood. It also increased mortality, decreased vitality, clearly, more risks linked to climate change, but also to globalization of trade. Regarding forest biodiversity, the indicators are less worrying. We also see a public policy that is torn between highly ambitious targets, low carbon strategy, for instance, and the weakness of actions because people don't put their money where their mouth is. So what we wish to say and what we wish to raise awareness on is that the current trend on forests is not the one that is announced in these policy documents. And this is dangerous and it jeopardizes our forests. The detail of this study will be available on a 6-page analysis document with a summary report of 2 pages. In order to take action, we underscored 5 main priorities. Of course, I don't have time to detail these priorities, but here they are. The first one is to rebalance the carbon balance, as Jean-François just said. Out of 118 million tons equivalent CO2 avoided by the wood chain, there's only 2 in product storage. So we must rebalance the different levers. We must reduce carbon sinks. Even if some won't agree with this, we need to increase the final lever that will not be eroded by climate change, and that is a substitution and storage in the products. We also call for a technical economic program by 2050 to renovate and adapt our forests. Our German friends are doing this, but we are not. We also want to boost demand in wood. And this is very important for the building industry. They need wood in order to be decarbonized. Why? Because materials are the key of circular economy, the key of valuing products and of managing resources and wood uses sustainably. Fourth priority, we must absolutely stop opposing sustainable forest management and sustainability and biodiversity. Today, we don't take into account the length of forest cycles. And with the current biodiversity protection that is implemented, we do not allow forests to adapt to climate change. And this is indispensable. Trees are part of the ecosystem. You cannot change trees without saving the ecosystem and vice versa. So you need a change in mindset here and not necessarily a change in governance. Lastly, we call for a radical reform of public policy and governance, private governance. Why? Because forests are de facto left aside in France. They are not part of climate policy. They are not part of the biodiversity policy or the circular economy policy. Neither are they part of the building policy. So all these challenges, I heard Mr. Lemicourt said that forests and wood are at the heart of transition. All these challenges around wood and forests are intertwined. So we need to have a governance that is united. We can no longer work in silos as we've been doing. So this is the main message I wanted to convey. It's a strong message. We consider that this effort is possible, but first and foremost, it is inescapable. Thank you very much, and thank you for listing the 5 priorities that you just mentioned. Guillaume Santoni, hello once again. Thank you for being here. You are president of the Plan Bleu and member of the Scientific Council of FRB, the Foundation for Research on Biodiversity. Your work focuses on biodiversity on different angles, tax angle, economic, legal, public policy angles, and your work also focuses on public policies. What are your thoughts today regarding sustainable development? Well, from the point of view of biodiversity, and I'm probably going to repeat what has been said already, but the great debate at international level today when it comes to biodiversity is the one between long sharing and long spending. Should we protect parts of our planet to intensify agricultural practices on another part of the globe, or should we, on the contrary, have a wider part of rural areas be exploited? So it's a debate that is more Anglo-Saxon than French, but thousands and thousands of articles are being published on that. I'm a bit skeptical regarding this discussion because I think we need both. And I think that the discussion is more focused on agriculture and not forests, because forests today, at least in France, are managed in a multifunctional and sustainable way. So we should be more on the long sharing, in the long sharing view rather than long sparing. Now, we all know, and I'll take 2 examples. We have some forests that are not exploited in France, that are not profitable. For instance, we have many municipality forests that are not used for different reasons. They're not profitable because they're too small, for instance. So the wood in these forests is not exploited from an economic point of view and not managed from a biodiversity point of view either. And for legal reasons, it's much easier to urbanize these areas than to privatize them. than a private land, because a municipality can deliver itself its own permit. And this is what is going on in France right now with Le Grand Paris. We wanted to reinforce the protection of forests. It has not been done, and so a lot of work is going on this land right now. We have official instructions from the Ministry of Agriculture to protect this land, and we could imagine a different way of managing these forests. Some don't have an economic purpose. The wood is important in terms of ecology. They help also mitigate climate change, and they're important in social terms, because people who don't have a garden go to these forests to walk. Also, Mediterranean forests is also another field we work in, and the value of ecosystemic services outside of the wood it delivers is important, even though it doesn't pay as much as wood production itself. And we see many forest fires that are increasing. Now the IPCC report on the Mediterranean basin shows that climate change is actually more serious in this area. So people are wondering if it's worth managing these forests that are not necessarily profitable. Also, there's inconsistency between public policies. And as Sylvie was saying, I think there is a lack of consistency. Now, I also think, contrary to Sylvie, that forests are a part of the biodiversity policy, but only in words and not deeds. For instance, the climate plan of January 2017 states that, and there's a specific sentence that says we're going to remunerate forest owners so that they provide more ecosystemic services and store more CO2. That was in July 2017, and in a few months later, you have a law that increases the taxation on forests and goes completely against this first idea. In France, you have a wealth tax on forests. And you have many inconsistencies of the like this, and it's not good for French research or the French economy. Now, another thing that doesn't work in France is that climate change and biodiversity sometimes are put in opposition. Very often we say how important forests are when it comes to climate change, and of course they are, but they're important also when it comes to biodiversity. And as it was said earlier, when it comes to forest biodiversity, we know that old trees have a very important role to play. Dead trees also are important, whether they are left on the ground or not. So I think we can be respectful of forests and recommend keeping these old trees and this dead wood. Now, one word on the low carbon label concerning forests. It's a good initiative, quite interesting, but what we see, though, if we look at it in details, that this proposal is mainly focused on climate, and we could make progress. And the problem is that the players didn't communicate enough. And I think that some practices can jeopardize biodiversity, although we should encourage biodiversity. Thank you very much for this. Antoine Damécourt, now you are the president of the National Federation of Forest Trade Unions, FRANCILVA. It's an important federation that represents forest owners at national level, i.e. 20% of private forests. You want to place innovation, production, and sustainability at the heart of forest strategy. Could you explain? Yes, hello. I'd like to remind you that forests account for 30% of the national territory, and 20% of our national territory is forest land. Now, this afternoon's topic is important. And last March, I was rapporteur for an opinion at the CESE that worked on how to value French forests. Now, French forests, plural, because it's true that there are different types of forests in Europe. And in France, there are great discrepancies between the forests we find in the south, in the north, in the west of France, or in the east. So it's a great wealth that our territory has in terms of biodiversity and management. And the forest owners are very different also. More than 3 million forest owners is a guarantee of biodiversity conservation. So let's go back to climate change. In this opinion, we had a prerequisite that we need to underscore. And that is the fact that today, we have to consider the balance when it comes to forests. Today we have, in the 1960s, we had plans, hunting plans to be able to control the animal population. And this hunting plan should be a tool that we use properly. Now, of course, there are problems everywhere, but this has become a problem, and it is a prerequisite for the forest to adapt. 80% of land biodiversity can be found in forests, so this goes to prove that for generations and generations, biodiversity has been kept. And the person managing a forest today will have to pass this on to the next generation. It's important to produce wood. Consumers need it to build their houses or to use it as a source of energy. It's important to produce construction wood, but also wood for energy. And you don't grow potatoes to have potato peels, but you never have any potato peels without potatoes either. So you have to consider the whole. You produce wood for energy, and we need to develop biomass. It's very important when it comes to renewable energies. And if you value biomass, you can value forests more. So there are more and more forests, but we don't manage them enough. Most French private forests focused on energy. So we have more than 3 million forest owners. Forests used to provide energy in villages. All schools could go to a little corner of forest, but then all of a sudden we stopped using these forests to exploit wood for energy purposes, and now this wood is used for construction purposes. So all of this to say that forests have to be considered in light of its history. We know where it was yesterday. We have to try to imagine the future of our forests. And as a previous speaker said, it's important because it acts as a carbon sink. It's rich in biodiversity, and we realize that with climate change, we also have sanitary attacks, and this is a real issue and might keep on growing. So we should not minimize research and development. We should keep working on this. And experts say that we might have more species in France of one specific tree to the detriment of another. But what we must do is really set up, this has been done through the Rainforest program. They are trees that were brought from Portugal to Scotland, and for each species, we try to look which could adapt to which territory. So we had a migration of species. This is an important topic.
In 2003, the heat wave caused more damages in retirement homes than in maternity wards. So in some regions in France, we know that we can't stand a temperature increase of just 1 or 1.5 degrees. So this goes to say that we need to renew our forests, because an old oak withstanding 3 weeks at 45 degrees Celsius at summertime might not recover from it. So we need to look into all of this. Now, private forests in France show a broad variety of different tree species, about 136, which is much more than what we can find in Germany, for instance. So we need to diversify the tree species that we have in forests. And public and private forests in France are very diverse. And the risk of losing that diversification is related to the fact that we do not have a diversity of uses. For instance, we sell poplar trees and we sell softwood trees, but beyond that, we no longer have major uses of forests. So these are jobs that won't be outsourced. Well, we need to see how we can approach this. So, for instance, I asked a poplar grower why he would not focus on birchwood instead. And he said it would be too difficult. But we need to do this in order to save the diversity that we have in French forests, because it's one of their main assets. And to do that, we need to focus on R&D. Today, if you have a forest, for instance, with different trees, some trees are doomed to disappear, for instance, ash trees. So through a taxation regime, through subsidies, through the services offered by forests, including as carbon sinks, well, this is all very important. So forests are very beneficial. And we need to share this message. Today, our main problem is that of forestry jobs. The forestry sector should be able to provide us with non-outsourced jobs. So it's what we call agribashing, and also on farmers. And people do no longer know how the rural world works. And people with the COVID crisis, people are starting buying country houses again and are starting to spend more time in rural areas. So we do things well, but we need to find a way of explaining why we do things the way we do them, just to make them accepted. Otherwise, we run into the problem of saturation. Well, if you'll allow me, please be brief. Okay, so just to give you an example, in my municipality, there are people that are opposing the fact that we will be cutting down trees. So it's just to give you an idea. It's just one example. But anyway, we have a lot of work to do. Well, thank you very much for all of that information. Bertrand Servois, you are the president of Unisilvac, Forestry Cooperative, and also of the CFF, and you are an agronomy scientist. Unisilva brings together forest holders. Its territory is mainly based in Auvergne, Bourgogne, Limousin, Centre-Val de Loire. And so now I'd like to give you the floor to discuss French forests. Well, the question of cooperatives. Well, cooperatives bring together forest holders to help them have a more professional approach. There's a major difference between forestry and agriculture. Actually, we should call our forum with a third F for forest. And I think you were saying that yesterday in your speech, actually. So there's a major difference between agriculture and forestry. It's the time limitation. For instance, in a forest, a forester will spend 150 years to grow a tree. But in agriculture, we're working at the scale of a year because you have harvest every year. If you make a mistake, you can notice it very quickly during your harvest, and then you can change things the next year. But when you make mistakes in a forest, the results are long-lasting, and it's very difficult to recover from it. So time is one of the main differences. A second difference. You can make a livelihood from agriculture, and it's a full-time job. And we can't say the same thing from forestry. Foresters are mainly forest managers. And to help them manage forests, we need to make their approach and their approach and their decisions are more professional. So we need to support foresters in that professionalization effort, and that's what cooperatives are there for. Then foresters need to manage their forest as best they can, and then they need to give it as a legacy to the future generations. So they need to renew their forest, they need to rejuvenate them. And we need to do that because we have aging forests in France. And as it was said, our forests might not be able to handle climate change. So this is why we have the 4G4, which are training systems managed by different players, including the cooperatives. And this way, young future foresters can know the various elements that are important for discussions and for decision making. And this way, they can also understand the technical elements. We also support them in terms of marketing and for instance, a forester on their own might find it difficult to sell their production. Then industrial players. They are the ones that we deliver these trees to. Industrial players have needs, and they need visibility. So anything that allows these players to have some visibility, knowing that 20, 30, 40% of the supply of a sawmill will be secured, then it will allow this mill to invest in tools, etc. And so this is another reason why bringing together supply players is particularly interesting. And this way we can secure the supply of sewing mills. Sewing mills need to invest as well. And today, we find it regrettable that we have two main branches for sewing mills, one for softwood trees and another one for hardwood trees. The sewing mills for softwood trees are now at European standards. They are usually at a comparable level as for their European counterparts. And this required a lot of investment. And this was done through family-based capitalism. However, for hardwood trees, including for oaks, we haven't seen that shift yet. We still have companies that are small-scale, operating at the level of a family that do not have the capex capability to be present at international level. Now, a third kind of player leading to that need of professionalization, consumers. When you deliver your wood panels to the market, etc., well, consumers are expecting this wood to come from sustainably managed forests. Therefore, cooperatives are in charge of it through diverse types of certification, including ISO standards. So this is also part of the professionalization that is needed. Then, public opinion. We've mentioned it a few times. Public opinion is increasingly interested in forestry. The previous minister said before the COVID crisis, that one of the good things was that in France we have 67 million COVID-19 experts. Well, we could say the same thing about forestry. And in the past, people didn't have anything to say about forest management. However, today, you could ask anyone on the street and everyone could tell you we need to be careful about biodiversity, we shouldn't be planting softwood trees, etc. So what does it mean? Well, it means that public opinion is sensitive to climate change issues. So, as we said, for 2 centuries, there was an intensive use of fossil fuel, including coal, gas, etc. And all of this contributed to climate change. And so now public opinion is saying basically that for 2 centuries, we have been using fossil fuels on your initiative, and now we are doomed to experience global warming, and we can see the results on our forests. And on top of that, there's some metaphysical rationale as well. When I was a kid, we talked about the Earth, and today we talk about our planet. And now we see our planet as a goddess, as some sort of divinity. And biodiversity is one of the links between mankind and this God that is our planet. We do not necessarily know what it entails, but we know that it resembles a religion. Now, moving on from public opinion to politicians. Politicians are elected by citizens who have an opinion on this. And as you know, this year is a dangerous year for us in France because we're going to have both legislative and presidential elections. So we can't just give extreme orders to a branch that is working on the very long term. It's a trial and error process. But we need to do this in a professional way, meaning that we have to carry out tests and assess the results in order to improve our practices. So this is what I had to say about this. But in any case, any innovation will be most welcome. And we always need to ask ourselves how long would it take to bear the results of innovation in forestry. Thank you very much. We are very lucky this afternoon to have with us in the room a French Senate member, Mrs. Paulina Verdy-Gagin. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this lunch and to this round table. I'm a Senate member for Aube, and I'm also a lawyer. That's my job. And I've always been sensitive to the issues related to environmental transition from a personal and an association member point of view. I'm the secretary for the regional union of the forest municipalities in the east of France. And in the east of France, there's a quarter of French forests. So I'm not part of the 67 million of experts. I'm a learner. And I just became a Senate member, so I like to listen to others. I come from a rural area, and from what you said, I can say that I agree with your first assumptions. Forests are an extremely complex world. There are many contradictory injunctions in the forest management. And so when we are covering such subjects, we need to get some perspective if we want to be efficient. So first of all, we're talking about a living environment, and many people tend to forest that. We're also talking about a very long time frame, as you mentioned. And forests in France have always been a strategic asset. This is how I approach it. Forests have always been a strategic asset so that we could become a naval power, or to generate energy for heating. And so I think that we need to go back to that macro level of reflection. We need to ask ourselves, can we do better with our forests in France? And I think there is so much room for improvement. Because if I compare ourselves to our neighboring countries, including Germany, who's always best in class in Europe, I think that we have twice as much forest as they do. However, their trade balance is much higher. So I think that the public and private sectors are going to have to work together. And I think that there are many things to do in order to better manage forests, which I think are a resource that we need to protect for future generations. But it's also a source of value creation for our economy. So I think that we need to make sure that we are not dogmatic on this. And I think that this is a subject that should be included in the Planning Commission work. And I agree with what one of the speakers said. We always have cross-cutting approaches to the forest, but for forests, I think that we need to have a more vertical approach. So thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm learning so much from you. I think that I'm actually taking a crash course on forestry today. Thank you. So we are now going to give you the floor for questions. We have a few minutes left, so you can ask your questions, and you can do that in line through the window at the bottom of the screen. We also have Mr. Quentin Kinski, who wanted to ask a question at the back of the room. Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm just going to follow your example. And I come from the Czech Republic, and we will be next for the EU presidency, and we will probably have an early presidential election. So we understand what you're saying, and we will probably learn from you in terms of long-term perspective. Could you maybe introduce yourself? Yes, Konstantin Kinski from the Czech Republic, and a representative of the forestry sector. And regarding what the senator said, on the macro level, I think that we need to go actually to the meso level. If we do not draw any lessons from climate change, I don't think that we will be able to combine our economic strength with the climate change mitigation requirements. I agree with what the speaker said. We need to base ourselves on science first. And then we need to focus on the price that is a reflection of the value held by a society for the forests in this instance. Thank you. Would you like to answer very briefly? Well, regarding the price, that's a very good question. There are many ongoing works on the carbon price, and there are also some research works on the value of biodiversity and the compensation for these services. In France, at the National Conference on the Environment, it was agreed that we needed to set a price for these two things. This was a very important topic to the then President of the French Republic. And then under the auspices of the Planning Commissioner, which is now called France Strategy, well, decisions were made regarding the carbon price and then regarding the investment in biodiversity. This report was published in 2011, and so some values were suggested that were very cautious, very conservative, and quite low, because some subsequent surveys showed that the prices needed to be lifted, and they are services that are also delivered by various ecosystems, including wetlands. So this is something that we know how to do. However, it is not leading to an impact on the market. And I think that we need to start with taxation, even though it's not an easy thing to do. It's not easy to have a taxation that is light for ecosystems. Let me give you an example. Very briefly, please. We have a number of tax incentives for construction and for trees that are planted. However, we do not take into account the environment in which those trees are planted. But it's a different thing to plant a tree in a meadow or on arable land. So there is a lot more carbon in a meadow than you have in arable land. So this is a path that we could maybe follow. Well, thank you for this answer. So we're now going to have additional questions from the people following us online. A question to you, Sylvie Alexandre. You were talking about governance that needed to be readapted. What are you suggesting to readapt governance and to integrate the forestry strategy to other strategies? So please be brief because we have very little time left. So what is the magic recipe? So if you want to make an omelette, first of all, you need to break eggs. So it doesn't mean that we need to completely change the current governance. However, we need some balance between the various powers. But from the various meetings that we have and the various reflections on that, we always come to the same conclusion. So I think that we've reached 24, 25 signatories for our paper. So this is really a collective reflection. But what matters But I think that citizens are ready for this, but they are waiting for an initiative from the government. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. Putting a price on carbon or on biodiversity, well, it's a very long work. That is the responsibility of researchers. I think that the main problem of the timber industry is underinvestment. And this is due to a default in policies. So what we want to show is that instead of discouraging private forest holders, because I think that there's a different type of organization between publicly held forest and privately owned forest. And 47% of our forests are not managed at all in France. So instead of discouraging forest holders when they want to adapt to climate change, I think that we need to have the right taxation incentives, and we need to have the right subsidies. So if your conclusion is that you're not going to do anything because it will just put you in debt, because it's not going to be profitable, etc., then you're not doing anything. And this is what's happening right now. So we need to reinvent policies to encourage private forest holders to become more professional, to have a more system-based vision. And to do that, we need to unify, harmonize the work of the various ministries in charge of this. We can't have that distinction between the various ministries. We need to make sure that the main players, both public and private, are truly committed to this. And there are some fundamental reforms that are needed for the timber industry, because more investment is needed. There are some reforms that are needed for private forest holders. And we explain in a very nice way that we are going to reform the construction product regulation, but some of them are based on fossil fuel and have a high level of carbon emissions. And the timber industry has always been opposed to this. And France was defeated on this because some part of the life cycle assessment on wood that was advocated by the European Union is not what was promoted by France. So please, could you conclude quite briefly? So we need more consistency, and we are not there yet. Thank you, Sylvie Alexandre. Very quickly, yes, on biodiversity and ecosystemic services. Well, for biodiversity for forests, we often sum it up by dead wood and big timber. But there are much more damages now due to global warming. So we can't just use this to summarize policies. And we need to have a healthy forests. We need also to have productive forests. We need to have a well-managed reforestation, and we need to mitigate the climate change impact. So it means that we should not be happy with just the 138 tree species that are already found in France, but we should maybe turn as well to exogenous species. And we are not saying that foresters need to have too much variety in the same place. So we need to support ecosystemic services. And to do that, we must invest in a smart way. And we need to have the right plant material, for instance, in order to prevent damages from game and wildlife. So we need to really focus on the fundamental aspect of ecosystemic services. So there are some specific aspects for forestry, including genetics.
We have time for one last question. This question goes to you, Guillaume Santoni. Do you have any concrete suggestions for the French presidency? Well, I think it's a bit late to express them because, well, things are ready to go already. Now, if we want France to be a leader in forest issues, there's still a lot to do. I think that in France, we have a government that wants a report on forest every 5 years. Either Bertrand Jouvenel, that was under Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, or others more recently. Anyway, every 5 years, there's a big report that says the same thing over and over again, and no decision is made. So I think that's a problem. Another problem, I think, regards time. And, you know, it's very difficult to see in the short term when it comes to forests. You have to look at the long run. And it's complicated to explain to some people that you have some costs entailed because you need to put protections against game, for instance, when you replant forest. But they don't understand because it's all in the long run. And what takes time requires also research and innovation. We mentioned this already. I see that French foresters are happy to have 200 million euros in the recent recovery plan, but if I'm not mistaken, the German have 500. And one difference with Germany also is that, you know, Germany has a more homogeneous forest. It's less interesting in terms of biodiversity than France, but easier to exploit because the more heterogeneous and the harder it is to exploit. And there's also a profitability problem that Sylvie mentioned. Many foresters no longer exploit their forests because there's high taxation and the costs are too high. If you compare the taxation of European forests, you see two things. First, French forests are slightly more taxed than other forests in Europe. And second, contrary to what we think, because some say that French forests are less taxed, but it's not always the case, and taxation has gone up recently. Slight augmentations, but overall taxation has increased. Thank you very much, Guillaume Sartoni, for these answers. This is the end of this roundtable. Now what I suggest is for each and every one of you to take maybe 30 seconds, if you can, to conclude. Jean-François Dott, you are first. What's really key today, if we want to take up the climate challenge, is renewal. So this entails to massively resort to planting trees and make sure we plant the right trees. And secondly, we also need to cut down trees. We won't be able to adapt our forests to climate change if we don't cut down trees. This is really important, and we can do it smartly. These cutting of trees are indispensable. We need a new plant cover, and we need these trees to go down. And also we need to raise awareness, and there's a pedagogy need. Foresters need to tell the public at large what's going on, especially the elites that have access to the media and universities, and they have to explain why it is so important to cut down trees. And this work has to start now. Yes, I think that clear cutting is a way to regenerate forests. It's an act of regeneration, so you cannot oppose the sustainability of management and clear cutting of trees. Keeping reasoning in terms of antagonism between the survival of trees and of biodiversity is absurd. This is why we wanted to publish this opinion, this point of view from an academic point of view. In our group, we have people from different backgrounds, and we have some scientists, some ecologists who work in our group. Antoine Crémer was awarded a scientific prize on forest genetics, especially oak genetics, and he really read the paper and contributed with his support. So it's important to have a systemic vision, a common responsibility, so that the French society can look at forests and understand how many services it provides. And it should, the French society should do as German society does, understand how important the forests are. And I think that the state has an important role to play, and that it's not playing. MPs, NGOs, the public at large, the sector, everyone is ready. They want resilient forests. They want to use wood in the energy sector, construction field. They want this transition. So now it's up to the state to translate these needs and this profound social need. It's all the more profound as we have just gone through a very troubled period of time. We need to move to actions today. Thank you very much. Guillaume Sartoni, very briefly. Yes, well, very briefly, a question. In 1998, a BVA poll was published and asked the French to recognize three different trees, oak, ash tree, and another tree. How many French people do you think managed to recognize the leaves of those three trees? Well, the answer is 0.5%. So there is a problem of education here of the public, and that's important when it comes to forest management. Very often, people don't know. In Anglo-Saxon countries, it's different, because the culture is different. Antoine, Damcourt. Mankind, in general, has a hard time managing anything that outlives human beings. And there's an urgent need for renewal of forests in France, and this requires commitment from the state. The recovery plan and 150 million euros might not be sufficient, even though it's good, but it's a one shot because the state needs to commit to paying also part of the strategic fund. The problem of this fund is that it doesn't have enough funds. Nature requires huge resources. This strategic fund needs to get funds, otherwise our forests will go nowhere. Lastly, someone is speaking without a microphone in the room and the interpreters cannot hear what is being said. Sorry. Inaudible comment. And lastly, Bestrans Servois. Yes, for the first time in several years, the state has dedicated important amounts to the recovery plan to help foresters reinvest in planting a forest. Now, if it stops at the end of 2023, it will have been for nothing. So, of course, we need to make these schemes sustainable and find the right resources. For a forester who invests with his own money, the return on investment will only take place 250 years later. So it's something you do, thinking that you're doing this for future generations, for your country, to pass on a forest that is lively and alive, but they need sustainable support. And we need something else now. I don't know what it will be called, but we need this. Thank you very much. Your messages were heard loud and clear. Thank you very much. You can go back to your seats.